I'm Ed Thomas. I'm the president of the Natural Hazard Mitigation Association. And how many people here are salesmen or women? I wish you all were, because we've got a product to sell. And the product is human, environmental, and economic safety, I believe. And we're going to be talking about how we can craft and sell this to people who have human brains that are hardwired to have a tremendous amount of difficulty dealing with low probability, high consequence events. David Ropeek, wonderful book on how safe is it really. We need to think in a systems analytical way, but most especially, please, we've got to stop making things worse. Let me be clear about this. Somewhere in the United States, and probably in many places in the world, every single day, a decision is made by a homeowner, by a local official, a federal official, a state official, a developer, a lender, an insurance person, that will inevitably make the disasters of the future worse based upon current climate conditions, to say nothing of who knows what's up with future climate conditions. We need to change our behavior. We need to change our evil ways. There are some places, most notably Charlotte-Mecklenburg, North Carolina, Tulsa, which used to be a basket case in terms of flood disasters, with an average every other year presidentially declared flood disaster, and they have transformed themselves. And the way that they have done it is inspiring. Yet when you talk to these folks and you hear about what was their reward for this, yes, they have had years and years without a flood. But as we saw in Colorado in 2013, the years and years without a flood are a blessing and a curse all rolled up into one. Because we had a generation and a half of public officials that went through life without a flood. They didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't expect what happened. Some could argue that just about nobody expected what happened in Boulder, at least nobody I've ever talked to. Yet we have a wonderful report that is one of the very few reports I've ever seen that talks about what happened, but talks about especially how the mitigation activities led by the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District for metropolitan Denver, which covers 45% of the population of the state of Colorado, how they were able to transform the risks and consequences of disasters throughout Colorado, at least their portion of it. National leaders, and it's wonderful to see the recognition of their fine work in this report. I recommend it to everyone. We have three major situations, as far as we can see, in terms of dealing with hazards. First is undeveloped property, which gives us the best opportunity to get things right. Tremendous payback for safe and proper construction in areas that haven't been developed or in areas that are being redeveloped. The second is existing development, where we can do lots of stuff. There's all sorts of things that can be done, from warning, evacuation systems, to things like cumulative substantial damage, all sorts of stuff that will help people for a better, different future. And then, following a disaster, we have an enormous opportunity that is frankly rarely taken to really get things right. When Mother Nature reveals where the floodplain really is, or where the tornado area is, and shows us the earthquake risk or the drought risk, and then we have a chance to spend some money, a cornucopia of money that comes forth, and spend it wisely on redeveloping properly in accordance with what NHMA is putting out as a living mosaic. We used to call it patchwork quilt. You all know the trends in natural disasters are soaring, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, with floods and other meteorological events leading the way. Floods, winds. Fairly constant across here in terms of geophysical events, but we see a tremendous amount of storm damage, we see a tremendous amount of flood and climatological events. Overall insurance losses bouncing all around the place, tremendously increasing. Flood losses increasing. Folks, this wasn't supposed to happen. This shouldn't have taken place. It had no business taking place. We had an economic study in 1976 that showed that due to the adoption of the National Flood Insurance Program, by the year 2000 or 2025, we would see a gradual diminution in flood losses. And it didn't happen. And it didn't happen for a lot of reasons. Some of them were that perhaps the standards weren't high enough. Some of them were that as we had the success of the Clean Water Act, areas that were once toxic, areas that were once a negative influence on property values, a river or a stream that was highly polluted, an ocean that was highly polluted, became a highly desirable feature, as is referenced and discussed in the wonderful book, Blue Mind, by a man named Nichols. And he talks about the tremendous impetus of human beings to live in areas next to near the water. And the property payment differential for living near the water, even when we know we're at risk. FEMA has programs to help reduce hazards. Flood insurance program has been a tremendous success. And there are other programs that would augment that on the part of communities, including the community rating system. The short answer is build even higher than the base flood elevation. Unless, of course, you've got the situation described by Brian Morella in this absolutely brilliant webinar put on by the Natural Floodplain Functions Alliance, talking about what happens when you have people 35 or more feet up above the base flood elevation and the land totally gives way because it's on a steep slope that's washed out by high velocity floodwaters. Corps of Engineers has pioneered this idea of buying down flood risk, buying down natural hazards risk. And it's a wonderful thought. You use insurance, building codes, zoning, levies. This is a core slide. You would not see that on my slides. Contingency response plans, outreach to create a smaller residual risk. Sadly, that is not what we're seeing in our nation. We're seeing, starting with an initial risk, with no adequate warning or evacuation, sea level rise, upstream development, increasing flood heights, lack of awareness, lack of proper insurance, difference in conditions insurance, business interruption insurance, flood insurance, critical facilities absolutely not properly protected from flooding, irresponsible standards of certain federal agencies that absolutely are, in my belief, clear violations of the law. We're building sewage and water treatment plants, not treating them as critical facilities, not elevating them or structurally flood-proofing them to the 500-year flood level. Increased development. More and more people living in areas subject to high risks and living with more valuable property. Building an infrastructure not properly maintained, levees are a great example of that. All of that leads, instead of reducing the risks, we're seeing more and more and heavier risks. I want to take just a quick second. This is a wonderful slide by our friends at Swiss Reinsurance, and we thank them for it. Efficient resilience opportunities, and they talk about the payback, improved building codes, very, very strong payback, loss benefit, beach nourishment, not quite as much, levee systems, not quite as much at all, improved standards for offshore oil platforms. But does anybody here notice an adaptation form that is not at all covered by this particular chart? Anybody? Anybody on the phone?
Land use.
Pardon? Land use, zoning, the dread land use and zoning word that so many people are dreadfully afraid of. We can protect people's property rights and have safe and proper land use. We can use things like transferable development rights and the like. Not all property is suitable for development and human occupancy. We can find ways around that. There's an old saying that says, well begun is half done. And you know, some people might agree with that. I think it's actually about correct. But would you agree that half done is well begun? Getting something half done, is that a pretty good start on things? No? Yes? Up and down if yes, back and forth. No, okay, we got one yes up in the front here. Well, Chris Nelson, one of our nation's top demographers, brilliant, brilliant man, great speaker by the way, says that in 2050, 1/2 of our built environment does not exist today. If we use zoning and higher building code standards to deal with that 50% increase in property, that's all we did for mitigation. I think it would be a huge win. And he repeated this at the Rocky Mountain Land Use Institute down the road in Denver just a few weeks ago in March. It talks about the boom to come. Much more stuff. Demographic pressures are going to drive development. People want to live near water. People want to live where they want to live. I've heard a lot of folks, particularly in the environmental community, say, well, just don't build in hazardous locations. Well, okay, fine. So we're not going to build in Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Massachusetts, California, the central United States because of the earthquake risk and the tornado risk. We're certainly not going to build in Pennsylvania because of the flood risk. Gee, where else? And I think there's probably about a half square mile someplace where we could all live safely that doesn't have any particular risk. The point is, you can't just say don't build in risky locations. That's a bad message. We need to give a message of hope that 98% of the time you can build on a site, but you've got to think about what you're doing and build safely and properly. For years, Colorado's avoided presidential flood disasters, yet the problem has been they lost the knowledge, skills, and capability to deal with them because it wasn't happening all the time. Let's look at our system of disaster relief, what we've got here. Everybody agreed that one of the most fundamental aspects of life is when you want somebody to do something, you reward good conduct and disreward bad conduct. It's called behavior modification. In our nation, do we do behavior modification with respect to disasters? Yes, we do. We do it backwards. We reward bad conduct and disreward good conduct, as we shall see. So, used to be taking flood insurance off the table. This is the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This isn't something I cooked up. Federal Reserve Bank of New York, in an article talking about how to pay for Hurricane Sandy, they point out that pre-Katrina, private market insurance and federal assistance amounted to about 84% of the dollar damages that took place. Post-Katrina, what's going on now with the infusion of tremendous funds from the HUD Community Development Block Grant Special Disaster Appropriation, it's $1.25 per dollar of damage. And as we saw so vehemently in the sessions at the Hazards Workshop, it is absolutely unclear that the surplus, that extra 25%, is going to the people who really need it most. Quite the contrary. For any of you that went to the closing session at the Hazards Conference or heard Kathleen Tierney, the director of the Hazard Center, talking about her personal situation in the Colorado floods. There's a real problem there. We are not rewarding good behavior. Please note that some businesses or individuals may not have been fully reimbursed for their out-of-pocket expenses despite the excess in payments. That's a very mild way of putting it, I think. We need to think about how we can solve this problem. And I think the United States Supreme Court has shown us a path. There's a case that came out that really upset a lot of people. It talked about the sky was falling, the world was going to come to an end as we knew it because of a victory by a property owner in the U.S. Supreme Court. I don't have time to get into the whole case. But the cut to the chase bottom line, the majority of the Supreme Court said, look, insisting that landowners internalize the negative consequences, externalities of their conduct is a hallmark of responsible land use planning that we have long sustained against constitutional attack. The deal in the Coons case, and I have an article on that, or anybody at Institute want to follow up on that. We did a detailed webinar on that just shortly after the case came out. Very simply, we need to talk to each other. The wetland managers in Florida that had a problem with Mr. Kuntz didn't demonstrate that, look, the reason we're turning down your building permit, the way you want to build, is because you're going to flood other people. It's real simple. You can't build the way you want it to build. This is very much in accordance with conservative property rights views. As population densities rise, we need to do this differently. So let's think about externalities and economics and disaster relief. Who pays for disaster assistance? Thank you so much, y'all do. Every single one does. And of course, the other people that pay for it, by God, are the disaster victims themselves. Boy, oh boy, did they pay. The misery, the suffering of what they have to do. I worked a couple of hundred disasters. I am passionate about the need to protect the property and the rights of people, but also protect people from being unnecessarily victimized by disasters. A lot of panoply of federal programs, primarily federal programs, charitable programs, all paid one way or another, at least in part by the federal taxpayer. But who benefits? It's a different group. The developers, the people who built there, the communities, get a lot of tax revenue from these areas, as is shown in the blue line. Tremendous increase in property values near hazardous locations like oceans and streams. Mortgage companies, engineering associations, architects, all sorts of people, and the occupants of the floodplains or the hazardous locations who get to live in a really nice place for a while. Our challenge is that disasters are bad, and they will get worse. We have to think about how the multiple ways that we can attack this problem. One is one that I am trying to work on in a variety of different ways, promoting the architect-engineer standard of care, the knowledge that architects and engineers have a fundamental duty of public safety. And if they breach that duty in the design of the stuff that they build, they can be subject to loss of license and also to litigation. Insurance industry efforts, government efforts, things like the incredible efforts in the state of California with earthquake building codes, earthquake retrofitting. We heard a lot about that earlier today. What engineers and architects are supposed to do, according to our friends at the American Society of Civil Engineers. Again, this is not NHMA wagging its finger at engineers. It's engineers wagging their finger at engineers. Planners, a very similar standard of care. We need to think about changes to federal policy. A couple of us, David Conrad and I, wrote an article for the Brookings Institute documenting in solid numbers that were vetted by people who really know what they're doing in the Congressional Budget Office, that with the changes in federal standards, we can save about $4 billion a year. And I got to tell you, I think that's a really conservative number. And they were primarily focusing on existing construction as opposed to future construction. We're losing the battle for a safe and sustainable society, and looking in the past for our vision of what to do in the present is a lot like driving down the highway at 80 miles an hour, steering by looking in the rearview mirror. Climate adaptation considerations permits and even impels us to look out the windshield of the car at the future. What I'm getting at here is typically what we do with wind loads, with flood loads, is we look to the past for guidance, and we don't look out the windshield of the car. So I have often said that there is a dime's worth of difference between climate adaptation and hazard mitigation as we use the term here. And that dime's worth of difference is a silver dime that is spread over the windshield of a car and becomes a mirror. We need to scrape that mirror off and look out into the future and realize that the climate is and always has been highly uncertain, and we can't just look to the past for guidance. The climate change was to the blame for the extreme Colorado weather conditions in 2013. Well, somebody who says they know what they're talking about is actually that the climate change has probably lowered the probabilities in reality. Risk was always there, has been there all along, and maybe in this case in Colorado it actually got a little lower. Who knows? But the point is, there was always a risk there. How are we going to do this Business as usual is not working. We need to build bridges with friends, allies, especially people who don't believe the things that we believe. People who know exactly and precisely what climate change is. It's a vast left-wing conspiracy, they think. It has to do with funding Obamacare. It has to do with implementing UN Agenda 21, taking away America's golf courses, guns, and ruining American society. Fine, fine, fine. That's what they believe. You know, we need to engage them in a different way and engage roadblocks of people who hate the flood insurance program, who are profound environmentalists, people who love the flood insurance program and want to build to a minimum standards. We need to teach them that the minimum standards simply are not good enough. So our message of better and safer design has to be crafted and prepared. And we need to know and understand what people care about. Not what we care about, what they care about. Do they care about so many of the people that are so conservative and hate the government, hate regulations? What do they love? They love the flag. They love the quality of life they have. They are concerned about the stewardship of the earth. They are concerned about passing the quality of life that they have to future generations. That's what they care about. We can engage them. We can engage someone that cares about wetlands only, and is much more concerned about critters that have multiple legs or slither or swim in the ocean than they are about critters that go around on two legs. Fine, we can engage them with messages as well. We need to tailor our message. It's always a message of doing things better and safer, but it has to be delivered to different audiences in different ways, showing that we care about what concerns them, so they'll care about us and our message. Stefan Holligat had a wonderful message at a conference I was honored to speak at in Europe. And he says we need to get away from this preventing disasters and talking about improving life. And his message to people who are entrepreneurs, companies, is there will be trillions of dollars spent on adaptation. Trillions, not billions, trillions. And we can either spend it wisely or not. We need to get a harm prevented message out there, and it works. When multiple different sources deliver a single message in multiple different ways, same message, build a safe room, delivered by lenders, by saying we'll give you a low interest loan or a zero interest loan, by public officials, by folks that are business, setting up business and industry. It works in terms of promoting safe rooms. We've seen this. There's a report that will be out shortly. I hope to have it for the conference. But we actually had a wonderful person from the National Institutes of Standards and Technology look at it, and they had marvelous suggestions that we are going to be incorporating soon. Right? Dr. Dennis Milletti told us how to do this, how to communicate risks and consequences, how to change public perception, and that's exactly what they did in Oklahoma. It's documented in our report. Milletti says you be clear, use varied sources, render it consistently, repeat it, sell it like they sell Coca-Cola, sell it like Suzuki sells motorcycles. Solo in Suzuki, winding up duet. That's why I bought my first motorcycle. No kidding. Support people in their search for more information, use words, graphics, and position lots of information around. That's what they did in Oklahoma. That's what they're doing in Texas. And it works. We've gone from a situation where virtually no one knew how to build an above-ground safe room in 1990. The totality of the work that we were able to find at the Federal Emergency Management Agency about that in 1990 was 3 sheets of Xerox paper put out by our friends at the USD Cooperative Extension Service. That was it, on retrofitting a bathroom with some 2x6s and sort of a lot of hope. We have changed that totally. Common message of disaster assistance, and here are just some thoughts on messages. Retrofit for earthquake damage, along the lines of what Janelle Mathey and the California Earthquake Authority are doing. not accepting a FEMA-based flood elevation, going at least 4 feet higher, which will help accommodate climate change and the like, recognizing the need to protect water quality. You're into endangered species? I love you. That's wonderful. Let me show you how, in the floodplain development, how we can stop harming our threatened and endangered species and still have development. It can be done. We need to have more emphasis on disaster risk reduction. For that end, FEMA has funded the development of a disaster risk reduction curriculum, an ambassador program, trying to give the best information out to citizens and citizen activists. And Katie's going to be talking more about that in just a few minutes. It's going to be cross-cutting curriculum, multi-hazards, multidisciplinary, and part of a much larger effort to change things. We need to think in a systems manner. It really bothers me and bothers a lot of other folks that people keep pinging on the flood insurance program and saying we need to change the flood program. Well, of course we do. But we need to change our system of disaster relief and our system of development in order to collaborate across the board to change our system from one that disrewards good conduct. Our friends in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, our friends in the urban drainage area will tell you that what has happened to them because of the result of their fine work, they have fewer disasters, which leads in our system to what? Fewer hazard mitigation dollars too. So they're not able to correct other stuff. We need to think about these trillions of dollars that we will spend, and I thank Stefan Holliget from the World Bank for this concept. The concept is resilience is this enormous concept, huge, enormous concept. And it has technical limits, which is a smaller circle here. It has trade-offs, it has constraints, and you keep getting down to a smaller bullseye. And unlike archery target practice, that bullseye is moving. That bullseye is moving as development takes place. It is moving as climate is variable, uncertain, or reveals itself that we thought we knew what the 100-year flood level was, and whoops, no, it's actually quite a bit different than that, quite a bit higher. And we need to think about, as we spend the resources, the trillions we will spend, one way or another on adaptation, we want to make sure that it goes into that circle on the target and not into the bystanders. Heard all too often people with ideas on how to do resilience, and if you do what they said, you would have a vastly worse situation, and I can give you specifics on that. Also, something that absolutely has to be kept in mind. We need to think about true resilience, including disaster risk reduction. Disaster risk reduction is not the entirety and the totality, but it has got to be a component part, and we've got to think about equity as we do this. A wonderful publication online from the NAACP by my friend Jackie Patterson, and a brilliant publication, Bounce Forward, that came out from Island Press and the Kresge Foundation. We need to find common values to get our message across. We need to join together. This is America's first political cartoon by Ben Franklin, talking about how the colonies had to join together. We've got to join together the silos of the professions. We've got to join together people who believe in climate change and disbelieve. We've got to bring together the developers, together with the engineers, the architects, the consumers. We've got to reach across the aisle to everybody, because we have a powerful message that absolutely needs to be brought across to so many different people.